stream. So give us 1 second.
All right, just give me the signal.
Okay, Shannon, we are good to go.
Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Shannon Stagman. I'm one of the co-lead organizers of Empire State Indivisible. For anyone on tonight who doesn't know us, we're a grassroots group based in New York City, working to increase civic engagement, advance progressive legislation at city, state, and federal levels, and elect better Democrats. So you can learn more about us or, join us in the fight. We're always welcoming new members at empirestateindivisible.org. So before we get into our debate tonight, we wanted to take a moment at the top to acknowledge that this is a pretty tumultuous time, both in New York City and around the country. And we really want to just express our gratitude to every one of you who's been out in the streets, standing up for Black lives and fighting back against police brutality in the last couple of weeks. We really appreciate it more than we can say, and we're in the fight with you. So we'd like to take just a brief moment of silence right now for Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Jamel Floyd. Thank you. So we know it's hard to think about other things right now, but New York has primaries coming up in just 2 weeks. So we deeply appreciate all of you taking the time to attend this debate tonight to hear from the candidates for Congress in New York's 12th district. Regretfully, we will not have all the candidates here with us tonight, as Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney is feeling unwell today and won't be making it. But everyone else has made it, and we're really excited to hear from them. So on behalf of Empire State Indivisible, I'd like to thank the candidates for being here, and Ben Max of Gotham Gazette for moderating tonight's debate. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Ben to introduce the candidates.
Thanks, Shannon. And thank everyone for watching here tonight. I appreciate it. If you are watching and you are a Democratic voter in New York's 12th congressional district, I hope you hear a lot of interesting things tonight and get ready to vote. As Shannon said, the vote is coming up quickly. Some people might already have their absentee ballots, and everybody is eligible to vote absentee this year due to a gubernatorial order and, of course, the COVID-19 crisis. There's also early voting coming up June 13th to 21st, and then primary day June 23rd. If you're tuned in right now and you know some other people in New York 12, tell them to tune in. Send them a text, send them an email, tweet at them, whatever it is you want to do, but grab some other folks in New York 12 who might be interested. Because we're going to have a good discussion tonight. Thank you to Empire State Indivisible for having me. I'm Ben Max from Gotham Gazette, as Shannon said. You can find our work at gothamgazette.com. You can find me on Twitter at tweetbenmax, and hopefully folks will engage both here in the stream of the debate and on social media, and we'll take a look at some of that as we go here. I'm going to introduce the candidates momentarily, but they are Lauren Ashcraft, Peter Harrison, and Suraj Patel. As Shannon said, Representative Maloney had agreed to be with us tonight, but her campaign informed us earlier that she's not feeling well and will not be with us. Before I get to the candidates again, the ground rules for tonight's debate. We're going to try to cover about 6 or 7 rounds of questions. Each candidate will get about a minute and a half to answer each question. And then we're going to try to have some open discussion on the same topic as the question. So once each candidate has about a minute and a half to answer, I'm going to kind of open it up, and hopefully we can have a fairly smooth conversation for another 2 minutes or so on each topic to see if people want to bat some things around, add to their answers, respond to somebody else. Maybe you forgot to say something during your minute and a half and it comes to mind. So we're going to try to do that each round. We'll see how it goes. Candidates also, I'm going to jump in with follow-up questions and clarifications sometimes. If I think you're being a little bit vague, I might ask you for an example or something like that. So don't be surprised if I kind of jump in. I'll try not to be too jumpy or anything like that, but I might ask you for some clarifications and some follow-ups, okay? And if for some reason somebody criticizes somebody else who's in the debate here, we will give you 20, 30 seconds to respond, but maybe not right away. It might be, it might be another minute later you'll get a chance to respond to some criticism or disagreement. We are not going to do opening statements. We're going to jump right into the issues, but we will have closing statements at the end around 9:25 to wrap things up. So you'll get a chance to sort of give that final closing stump comment then. So let's get to it. The candidates, I'm just going to do a brief introduction of the three candidates we have with us tonight. Lauren Ashcraft is a community organizer, stand-up comedian, and democratic socialist. She's endorsed by Brand New Congress, New York Progressive Action Network, Long Island activists, and 24 progressive organizations from around the country. She's fighting to bring full and equal representation to one of the most unequal districts in the nation. Suraj Patel is a first-generation American attorney, business ethics professor who worked for the greatest president of our lifetimes, Barack Obama. These are in the candidates and campaign's own words. Suraj Patel is a progressive Obama Democrat running to get corporate PAC money out of politics and to restore the promise of New York, education, opportunity, and mobility for all. And Peter Harrison has lived in the 12th Congressional District of New York for 14 years, spent the last decade as a housing activist, and was the senior housing advisor for the progressive think tank Data for Progress, where he worked on the Homes Guarantee, a national progressive housing plan, and advised on the presidential campaigns of Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, and Julian Castro. He's the co-founder of two startup companies, Brightbox, a secure cell phone charging locker, and Homebody, a tenant organizing app. And Pete teaches about technology in the MBA program of Baruch College, where he is also a delegate assembly member of the PSC CUNY Union. So, welcome to our three candidates. Thank you so much for being here. You've heard the ground rules. If you need any clarification on those, let me know. But we're going to jump right into topic number one. I'm going to change up the order that folks speak first. We're just going to go this round in alphabetical order by last name. So that means Ms. Ashcraft, you'll be first, followed by Mr. Harrison, Mr. Patel. So we'll go Ashcraft, Harrison, Patel this first round, and I'll let you know in subsequent rounds what order we'll go in. So we're going to talk about racial justice, racial injustice, and police reform now to start. Give us some thoughts, please, on how you think policing, structural racism in law enforcement should be changed. What is the federal role? What would you do if elected to Congress to make changes in this regard? And Ms. Ashcraft, we're going to start with you. Candidates, please unmute yourselves when it's time to talk, and just be sure you're not muted when it's your turn. So, Ms. Ashcraft, over to you.
Thank you so much. Oops, can you hear me?
There you go.
Okay. Thank you so much. This is such a traumatic time in our history. And we could have avoided being in this situation had we had active leadership for the last 27 years. But right now, we need to do what we should have always done, which is defund the police. We also need to make sure that money is redirected to education, to mental health care, to social work. And we need to fight to make sure that every single instance of police brutality is tracked and managed in a spreadsheet, in a database managed by the federal government. We need to repeal qualified immunity. And we need to make sure that we pass bills that demilitarize the police. We have a flow of military equipment and weapons flowing to local police forces. We need to stop that flow and demilitarize our police forces as well. And we do see that police have attacked and killed Black people across our entire nation. So we need to make sure that we are also passing bills to require necessary education to stop racial profiling, and also require body cams to be active and worn by all police officers at all times.
Thank you. And we're going to go over to Mr. Harrison.
Hello, can everybody hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Great. Yes, I was involved with the Black Lives Matter protests in 2014, 2015, the city around Eric Gardner's murder, and not much has changed since then, but these protests are different. And I know all of us have been out there in some capacity, And that does give me a lot of hope. I am hearing from Black leaders, women, young people in this city and across the country that are creating the kind of pressure that we need to change. But they're not asking for just police reform. They are talking about structural reforms. And to me, that means attacking the logic and the incentives of the capitalist system that the police operate under. And to me, that means taking on the real estate industry. It is not a coincidence that the police protect property over people. They are doing their jobs. The real estate industry needs the police to keep Black and brown people out of the fancy parts of this city, keep them in the poor parts of this city, and manage the process of displacing them and gentrifying neighborhoods. That's what they do. And that's also why Mayor de Blasio and Governor Cuomo are scared of pissing off the police. They're scared of pissing off the real estate industry because that's who they rely on. Unfortunately, that's who a lot of politicians in New York rely on, including Representative Maloney. So I absolutely support defunding the police. I'm an abolitionist. Those are absolutely things that need to get done. What happened in Albany today, what got introduced by congressional Democrats are good starts. But we have to take on the capitalist system and the real estate system. I've been doing that for 10 years, and I'm prepared to do that.
Thank you. Thank you. And Mr. Patel, over to you. Make sure you unmute yourself first.
Yep. Thank you for having me here today. And thank you to the other two candidates for joining. First off, let me just say I hope that Representative Maloney has a speedy recovery and feels better soon, and just wishing her that. Let me just start by saying this. This is an incredible moment in our history. It feels like 1968 out there. And this time has to be different. You see, the aspirations of the millions of people, myself included, that are marching on the streets, they need to be turned into laws. Those aspirations need to be turned into legislation. And that legislation has to come from new people who had no hand in creating the systems of racial and systematic oppression that our country has had. I had a law professor, a famous one named Brian Stevenson, when I was in law school. And he's a famous civil rights lawyer that defends juveniles of color on death row in the South. Yes, that still happens in the United States of America. And Brian Stevenson used to say that the legacy of that slavery itself was propped up by an ideology of white supremacy, or else you couldn't justify it. And when slavery ended in 1865, white supremacy carried on another form, in the form of black codes, in the form of Jim Crow, later in the form of excluding blacks from the New Deal. Then when black people went to war for us in World War II, they returned to a nation where the GI Bill did not cover them. They returned to redlining and racial discrimination. And here we are now in 2020 with police brutality and a criminal justice system with disparate impact, which we believe, everyone on this stage right now believes, is discrimination.
Thank you.
Must end.
So let's open it up. Make sure you're unmuted, candidates. Let's open it up for a couple minutes. I don't know that I heard a lot of specifics of federal legislation. I heard some. Maybe people want to jump back in there, things that you would either support that already exist or try to introduce if you're elected to Congress. Let's see how it goes. Jump on in.
I'll do it. To start off, I think we're all going to end up agreeing on a lot of things on this. But, look, I believe in there are several bills already. The Stop Militarizing Law Enforcement Act. I believe in mandatory de-escalation training. I believe in demilitarizing the police. I think we should ban the fact that our surplus military weapons with our defense budget, which is so bloated, allows the Army to have surplus weapons that then get donated to police departments around the country. Study after study shows, evidence-based policy shows us that demilitarized police departments with less, with de-escalation training, have significantly less incidents of police brutality, and their communities are equally safe. So these are just wrong-headed policies. There are very specific policies out there. A national ban on chokeholds, obviously. These are things the federal government can do to signal to the state and local level that we will not tolerate any longer any one of
Ms.
our
Ashcraft,
black...
do you want to jump back in?
Yeah, I do want to add, the federal government throws money at local police forces whenever they adopt certain national priorities. And unfortunately, these priorities have harmed people of color across the entire nation. So we're seeing local police forces take on the war on drugs, which is based on racism. So first of all, we also have to decriminalize drug usage and make completely legal the use of cannabis. We need to end mass incarceration as a result of the drug wars. We have to also ban for-profit prisons, because there is that cycle of money being thrown from these lobbies and for-profit entities at politicians that continue to vote against the best interests of our society. So there is a lot to be done at the federal level, and when I talk about defunding, I'm talking about using the money that we throw at these police forces and putting it towards social work, mental health care, Let's
let Mr. Harrison jump back in. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I mean, I certainly agree with what Suraj and Lauren are saying, but I do want to come back and talk about why this is more about just than police reform or criminal justice reform, which are deeply important. But again, listening to Black leaders, they're saying it's not just about police reform either, and they're right. A really good example of the idea of criminalizing space and policing space for the interest of real estate is our curfew that just happened a couple of days ago. This is something where the curfew criminalized behavior that was happening in the streets. That is what the war on drugs are. That's what homelessness bills are. That's what that is. So again, until you really address the logic of capital and the logic of property, you can't fix these types of problems. So the number one legislation that we can focus on is housing as a human right. If we take away that danger and that insecurity, and frankly, that profit motive that just feeds on certain neighborhoods, particularly right now, communities of color, we can have the kind of security and community empowerment that we need. And however we re-envision public safety around that spawns from that idea of community safety and empowerment first.
Just quickly, if anybody wants to jump in with a quick comment, we're going to move on to our second topic. But
I do. I have a quick comment.
Well, I was gonna ask a little bit of a follow up. You could say whatever you want. I was going to ask, if there's more of a role, if you think there's more of a role for a member of Congress in New York City to be outspoken about how the mayor and the NYPD are approaching something. Mr. Harrison's answer just got at that a little bit with the curfew, but go ahead, Ms. Ashcraft. We're just going to do 20 more seconds each here.
Yeah, I just wanted to say housing is a human right, but we can't ignore the fact that this problem didn't start this term or yesterday or even within the last 2 decades. We stole the land that we live on from indigenous people, and this country was built on slavery. And that kind of racism is part of why so many Democrats, including our opponent, voted for the crime bill. It's why we still see racial profiling and targeting of Black people across our entire country. So we have to actually push for vocal, like you said, Ben, vocal leaders in Congress to have anti-racist platforms, to have anti-racist conversations, and to make sure to have and start those uncomfortable conversations every single day. Because as white passing people like myself, it's our responsibility to use whatever platform we have to change the minds.
Mr. Patel, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with everything that was just said. I will just answer your question, though. Yes, absolutely. We have an obligation here to call out the mayor and the aggressive tactics by the NYPD. This is, I was just on Avenue B the other day. My neighbor got looted at 2:30 in the morning by professional looters. It seems the NYPD is so focused on harassing peaceful protesters and our First Amendment rights that they have been derelict in their duty in many cases to actually, police crime. And it's taking away from all our rights. I think that the curfew was absurd. And the mayor has a lot of apologizing to do. And I certainly think the NYPD has some resignations that they need to send our way.
Okay. And final quick thought, Mr. Harrison, go ahead.
Yes, I think it's important for everybody to call out any elected official. But I think it's very important right now to recognize, as I've said many times elsewhere recently, is that the mayor may or may not survive this, and he may or may not be in a position to. But we've got to call out the fact that the police unions are calling the shots here. The mayor put this curfew in because the police were ignoring looters and trying to create a narrative against the protests because they themselves were counter-protests. So you've got to call that out. I think a lot of the progressives at the state level, city council did that. I don't think enough happened at the federal level, certainly New York 12. But that's what has to happen.
Okay. Thank you all. So that went pretty well. Let's move on to the next topic. Obviously, we could spend the whole hour and a half talking about each of these. But the next topic, and we're going to start we're going to go Mr. Patel, Ms. Ashcraft, Mr. Harrison to start this. So it'll come to you first, Mr. Patel here. The topic is the triage and the recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. First, how do you evaluate the federal relief packages so far in terms of what's come through Congress? Obviously, you're all going to agree on assessment, most likely, of how the president has handled it. Let's sort of leave that to the side for now. Let's talk about Congress, where you're hoping to go. Evaluate what's come through Congress so far and what still needs to be done, and any ongoing, priorities that you would have in the future if you were to be elected. So let's go to Mr. Patel on that question, evaluating the federal relief so far and what needs to be done next in terms of the COVID-19 crisis. Go ahead.
Epic failure. I've got to say that the response of Congress was so woefully inadequate. And it's partially because this is now the second time in my adult lifetime that big banks and corporations and others were bailed out before small businesses and families and workers. And you need to look no further than the fact that the bulk of our representatives, including the incumbent, take more corporate PAC money. $9 million this decade alone, Representative Maloney has taken in corporate PAC money, in her career, is taking in corporate PAC money. So the people who fund her campaigns, those very same corporations, are the ones that are first in line on the bailout. Let me tell you something. As a person who personally had coronavirus himself, I was in the recovery mode early April when my brother, who is an ER doctor in the city, and I wrote the first universal testing plan for coronavirus and published it in Wired magazine. We beat Congress by 3 weeks. I know that Donald Trump is to blame for a lot of things, but Congress also has its own voice. How could it possibly be that a challenger in a congressional primary wrote a plan for the one thing that could get us out of a perpetual cycle of spikes in infections in a $2 trillion bill? How could it possibly be that the Congress lacks pro-science representatives so much so that they don't even think about these kinds of things? Now, I've talked to hundreds of small businesses. We've had 3 town halls of small businesses. So many New York businesses right now are in risk of being shut down forever because of this crisis. And it predates this, of course. Rents are too high. Regulations on small businesses and things in the city have already seen us moving towards a bunch of chain big box stores losing the character of our neighborhoods.
Do you want to quickly name just 1 or 2 specific policies or pieces that you think need to be part of a next package?
Absolutely. We need startup loans. A lot of these small businesses, no one who's run a business, anyone who's run a business knows that cash flow is the lifeblood of a business. Okay. And no one is prepared to run for more than 2 weeks without it. So we need startup loans for these and grants for these companies, small businesses that haven't that don't know how they're going to operate with 40-50% occupancy.
Okay, Ms. Ashcraft, go ahead.
The response has been absolutely reprehensible. Whenever we think about the fact that over 71% of our district rents their home, and so many people in our district haven't been able to pay rent since March, and we're living off of a $1,200 check that maybe you received portions of it. I am pushing for $2,000 per month per person, regardless of immigration status, regardless of income level, because it cannot be means tested and exclude people who absolutely need this money right now. We need to make sure that we do cancel rent at the federal level, and my partner has been struggling greatly because he relies on an income from small business. And the small businesses have been really struggling because the first bill allowed for huge corporations to come in and snatch up the available help. These loopholes are allowed in these policies purposefully so that the huge corporate donors that throw money at our opponent and at so many Democrats and Republicans in Congress continue to profit. We need to close those loopholes and also close the loopholes that have allowed New York State to cut Medicaid during this time in a pandemic. Also, we need Medicare for all. If that wasn't clear before a pandemic, it's absolutely clear now. We need to make sure that every single person can go to the doctor and not worry about a lifetime worth of debt. And we have to have that conversation right now.
Mr. Harrison, go ahead.
Yeah, let's be clear here. Congress did exactly what it was supposed to do. It got bailouts to corporations, got bailouts to some banks, got a lot of bailouts to real estate right out of the gate. And let's not forget the Federal Reserve pumping in trillions of dollars into the financial system to make sure investors were okay. So it's not that it's broken, it's working exactly the way it's supposed to. And I think something that was very revealing, we had a forum a couple of weeks ago that Suraj and Lauren and I were on, where Representative Maloney actually said that PPP was a success because it had run out of money so quickly, that it was so popular. I mean, that's the mentality down there. That's the mentality of folks that are used to getting in front of corporations and investors. So it's not at all a mystery that this didn't happen. What has to happen, and frankly, what plenty of other industrialized countries in the world, is a basic guarantee. The federal government has endless amounts of resources. Even if it was 75%, we could have guaranteed rents, we could have guaranteed payrolls, we could have guaranteed expenses. There was no reason for the economy to collapse at the scale that it had. It did not do that in other countries because they have governments that are more functional and more in tune with workers and the working class and small businesses. So that is a product, that is not a flaw, that's the design of this system. So I think starting there, and I'm certainly one that's been pushing cancel rent for commercial as well as residential, that's still not even happening because, and Ilhan Omar's got a great bill that's introduced right now. We have to work on the homes guarantee with her office. There are solutions that other people in Congress have done, but the leadership of the Democratic Party, Speaker Pelosi, have just not done it. And that's, I think, revealing. We know the GOP and President Trump are bad. They're not our friends. But what this period has showed is that a lot of Democrats are not our friends as well.
So let's open this up. I want to follow that part of the discussion up with a prompt on the same subject, but sort of applying it more generally. If you go to Congress, how do you do that? How do you get packages like this to be more like you want it to be when, as you are admitting, the sort of general zeitgeist in Congress would not necessarily align with the viewpoint that you're bringing? What's the tactics? What's the strategy? Go ahead, Mr. Patel. Go ahead, jump in.
Let me just say, first things first, I would show up. I'd show up. Representative Maloney was not even in Washington, D.C. for the CARES Act vote. I don't understand why. Truth is that I think all of us are in broad agreement here on what we need to do, which is bail out people. I support Lauren's UBI type idea for the rescue. I support Peter's rent policies. And what we need to do is build coalitions by electing more people like us, frankly, to Congress and bring that bold generational change that's so needed. I mean, the people who created these systems that failed around us during COVID, during this current moment when we're all eyes gazed on a problem that has stained our country for 400 years, it's because of the same people that are in those systems that don't even recognize their own failures.
Ms. Ashcraft, do you want to jump in on how you would try to make some of this change that you're talking about if you're actually in Congress?
Absolutely. Along with coalition building and seeking out allies and helping people like yourselves get elected, we also have to make sure that we continue to utilize our platform to shape conversations. And one of the conversations that I and my campaign have had this whole time is that the federal government's budget is just a list of our representatives' priorities, and somehow we have never made the cut. So yes, we can absolutely afford to pay for $2,000 a month per person. We can afford to cancel rent. We have to have these conversations, and the problem is, if we don't pay for these things, then our economy, our people, will be suffering for decades and decades to come. Now is the time to just throw ideas like PAYGO, which is propaganda. We have to throw ideas like austerity out the window. We need to make sure we help our people. And we need representatives in there that are fighting and calling this out and calling austerity measures and saying that we can't afford something out for what it is. It's a lie.
Thank you. Mr. Harrison, final thought before we move on to our next topic about how you would make some of what you're calling for happen?
Yeah, I got some good news and some bad news. I've been a housing activist for 10 years through 3 rent law fights. And I can tell you, organizing outside of the political power elected office is the number one thing. That's really hard. That's the bad news. But the good news is it is still possible. And what we've seen over the last 48 hours or really 2 weeks of protests and the action at the federal level shows that when people organize, you can force change. This is going to be true for the Green New Deal, for Medicare for all, for the Homes Guarantee, whatever it is. We do not have the votes in the Senate, but we do have the bodies on the streets. That is the ultimate thing that we need. And as a democratic socialist, I do think of it as my view as a lawmaker as how do we transfer power from the senators in DC out to the people? We're seeing that in the streets in this country right now. That gives me a lot of optimism that we can build on this energy and organize to other vehicles of change that we need in other policies.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to move on to our next topic here, which is housing and homelessness. This round, we're going to start with Ms. Ashcraft and then go to Mr. Harrison and Mr. Patel. So a couple of, basically want to hear your housing platform, but we want to start, please, with NYCHA. Do you think the federal monitor is working? What else needs to be done? How would you seek to address the needs of the New York City Housing Authority if elected to Congress? And then, if you can, after you're addressing NYCHA, segue into broader housing and homelessness issues. So Ms. Ashcraft, we'll start with you.
Absolutely. So I bring with me experience of working for housing at the federal level. My first full-time job was at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And thereafter, I worked for a nonprofit that provided affordable housing to people that were on the verge of homelessness. So this is a great passion of mine. And I do believe, and it is a fact, housing is a human right. And we need legislation that is bold and progressive and fights to abolish homelessness, which we absolutely can do. I know Peter has worked on the Homes Guarantee, and I've been really excited to be on calls with People's Action, and I've proudly pledged my support for that platform. And I also wanted to say that I've spent a lot of time in my neighboring community of Queensbridge, and I've seen with my own eyes how people with disabilities are unable to use the elevator because it doesn't work. They crawl up the stairs. I've seen people's leaks that have ruined all of their belongings. They are not able to live in a place that is livable. So we also need a Green New Deal for public housing. And with that, homes would be renovated and also brought up to par with 100% renewable energy. And with the Green New Deal for public housing, jobs will also be provided, training will be provided so that people in NYCHA communities are able to most benefit from this piece of legislation. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mr. Harrison.
Yeah, well, thank you, Lauren, for the kudos for the Homes Guarantee. I'm very proud of having worked on that with being the Senior Housing Advisor for Data for Progress. Certainly with Suraj and Representative Maloney would be on that as well. Going specifically first to NYCHA, NYCHA works. It is probably the most successful affordable housing program in our country. It is not failing because of structural problems of the idea of publicly owned homes. It's not failing because it's people of color living there. It's being murdered and has been over 40 years. There is a at least $32 billion capital budget shortfall in NYCHA that is being chipped away at for decades under Democrats, Republicans, you name it. So the first thing is to acknowledge that these programs do work if they're funded properly, if tenants on the ground that are already been organizing for decades. I've been very active with Ravenswood and Queensbridge and Holmes Isaac Towers up in the Upper East Side. These residents know what needs to happen in their buildings. They're capable of running these things, but it's a very racist, patriarchal system top down that NYCHA's been built on. So part of the Homes Guarantee is not just fully funding public housing, it's actually expanding it. Like, we've got to go on the offensive as Democrats and as progressives. We need more publicly owned homes in this country. We've got to repeal the Fair Cloth Amendment that blocks public housing from getting funding. We've got to build different models of public housing, some for home renters, some for home owners, different levels of income, different styles. These are all solutions that are worked on in the Homes Guarantee that can take away that profit motivation in housing that, again, comes back and ties together all these other issues of economic inequality, racial injustice, and climate inaction.
Thank you.
It starts with housing. It starts with decommodifying housing.
Thank you, Mr. Patel. Over to you. NYCHA and other housing policies.
Thanks, Ben. Look, when $2 billion a year were cut from NYCHA's operating budget in 2001, we could fairly say, okay, George W. Bush and the Republicans cut public housing to hurt New York and public housing residents. Sure. But when 2009 and 10 rolled around and Democrats controlled the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and our Democratic representative had amassed some seniority, and every other congressperson was able to put in tons of funding for projects in the stimulus bill, Representative Maloney did nothing to restore the operating budget cuts of NYCHA. It's starving because it was starved by Washington. And I would take issue with the idea that NYCHA works because it clearly doesn't. There isn't a week that goes by that the mayor's questions on the Brian Lehrer show don't include people saying, hell, have the federal government take us over, have anything. This is we have to reform this agency. I do believe that it's patriarchal. I do believe that these people, residents of public housing should have more localized control over their repairs and services. I do believe they should be fully funded. This is a stain on our city. We live in the most unequal district, one of the most unequal districts in the United States of America, but it's also one of the most segregated. And those two things are completely tied to one another. And we have an obligation to elect a representative whose priorities lie with the most marginalized first, because we have to do right by them.
Thank you. So to try to keep on schedule, we're just going to do a couple more quick comments on this one. But does anybody want to jump in on anything else that wasn't mentioned? Any other housing policy you want to put forward? Any funding issue you want to mention that really comes back to the federal government?
I'd
Sure.
love to jump in. So one of the things that I alluded to earlier is that Queensbridge and so many other NYCHA communities are not accessible to people with physical disabilities. And that has to be a priority at the federal level to make sure that everyone can get to their home without having to crawl up the stairs, which I have literally seen with my own eyes. And I also wanted to say, you mentioned the Mayor de Blasio earlier and leaders speaking out against him. I've wanted him to resign for a very long time, and it's because of a comment that he made when I was with a group called Fight for NYCHA at a town hall, and he looked people in their eyes that were part of a NYCHA community, and he explained to them that he understands the issues that they face better than they do. And we need to understand, as aspiring representatives, that NYCHA residents understand the problems better than we ever can based on any research, and they need to be sitting at the table when we make decisions about their communities. Thank you.
Mr. Harrison?
So when I started this campaign, of course, I'm like the housing person. A lot of people said, oh, housing's a local issue. You should run for something local. Nobody's saying that anymore. And they're saying that because of the epic crisis we've got of folks paying rent, whether they're in NYCHA, whether they're in Stuytown, wherever they are. But what I want to make very clear to people is that the federal government is deeply entwined in housing policy. We just don't call it that. So for every dollar the federal government spends on things like NYCHA, on Section 8, on homelessness services, it spends $3 subsidizing homeowners out in the suburbs, making 60% of those people making $200,000 a year. So the federal government is deeply entwined in housing policy, and it's our goal and frankly our responsibility as leftists in Congress to say the federal government is not letting the market work here. It's just putting capital largely into white homeowners out in the suburbs. So we've got to change that and revert that. And NY-12 is 72% home renters. There's not a single home renter in Congress. I mean, maybe there's second homes in DC, but there's a huge disconnect in our federal policy between the lives of people living in our cities and the money getting spent at the federal level. We've got to change that.
Final thought here, Mr. Patel?
No, I mean, I agree. I agree with the sentiments here. I am passionate about public housing. I think, we just basically, Not a single person in the New York congressional delegation from the city sits on even the relevant committee that would be able to fund and govern this, which is transportation, housing, and infrastructure. What kind of misplaced priorities are we talking about? What have these people been doing for 2 decades?
Let's that's an interesting note that goes back to the tactics question, which just so you know, after this next question and the follow-up in the open discussion, I do want to get back to tactics and strategies because it's obviously such an important part of not just having the ideas but executing them. So we're moving on to the topic of healthcare. We're going to start this round with Mr. Harrison, then Mr. Patel, then Ms. Ashcraft. You all, correct me if I'm wrong, have expressed support for Medicare for all. How do you propose getting there? What's the path to making that a reality? What version of the plan do you support? Go into some of those specifics for us, please. Go ahead, Mr. Harrison.
Sure. Yes, I absolutely support single-payer Medicare for all, and I know everybody else in the race does. Representative Maloney is a co-sponsor on at least one version of it. And I also really appreciate her being the bill for the 9/11 first responders. That's something she's obviously very proud of, and she should be. I wish she'd combine those two things. I remember seeing her go to, I think it was the Met Gala with a fire jacket on, raising awareness of the 9/11 bill. And I thought, how amazing would that have been had she put Medicare for all on the back of that jacket? What a powerful sense of solidarity and leadership to say, of course, 9/11 first responders deserve universal health care for the sacrifices that they made for us. Every American deserves that. And I wish she was here tonight that we could ask about that. But why I support Medicare for all, and I think why the conversation has changed, of course, is the fact that 40 million people lost their job in the last couple of months, and they lost their insurance because of it. So if you want to protect people during a pandemic, do not tie their health care to employment. That's first. Second, and I think a bit of a difference of approach on this is if you want to see the ingenuity and the inspiration of American people that is there underneath everything, make healthcare a right. Just think about what it would mean to not be stuck in a dead-end job because you have insurance. Think about what it would be like for folks with disabilities or pre-existing conditions to not have to do a job. Like, I get so mad, my blood boils when I think about our society being robbed of that next great cancer researcher, that next artist, community leader, entrepreneur that's not going out for the idea because they can't afford insurance or they can't afford to take the risk without that kind of security. That's not freedom.
Mr. Patel, over to you. What's the path to Medicare for all? What else is to be done about healthcare? Go ahead.
Yeah. So yes, I support Medicare for all. We all do. But I think that, again, this is an idea that's long overdue, and it's going to require structural change. It's going to require new people in office who have new tactics and ways to get the American people behind them. Look, we have to build coalitions in Congress and across this country in order to enact the policies we're talking about. And there is obviously some semblance of a trade-off between purity and coalition building when it comes to doing this. But I think we saw with coronavirus the structural inequities in our healthcare system laid bare right around us, and there's no better time for pushing this than now. And so I think we've got to start with that. So I got to tell you something. Of course, I support Medicare for all. I would be a co-sponsor right off the bat immediately. But we also proposed a plan in our campaign called Medicare for Kids, very simply because getting children health care is something that 80% of Republicans too agree on and could begin to transition us to a full system like that. And it is Medicare. So there are ways, I think, to begin to get there while also fighting for the ultimate goal. I will not compromise my principles. And I do believe that every American has a right to health care and Medicare, a single payer system. But I will work every which way I can to get more people that health care.
Thank you. Okay. Ms. Ashcraft?
I know you said you're not willing to compromise on your principles, but I'm not willing to offer compromises. I look at members of my family who've almost died because of being afraid of a copay. I think about the fact that I've battled myself trying to find health insurance and privileged enough to have a domestic partner that was able to offer me his coverage. We have 23,000 people in the district right now who are afraid to go to the doctor because they have no health insurance at all. Medicare for all is my compromise. That is the starting point of our conversations, and we need to organize and partner with grassroots organizations across the entire country. I've been to town halls with National Nurses United and DSA, and we've spread the word together and created educational campaigns, and these groups have also been part of getting Representative Jeffries to finally sign on to Medicare for All. These are the types of grassroots organizing that I will never step away from, and these partnerships are how we get things done. So we absolutely can never abandon working with organizations across the entire country that are dedicated to this cause. And again, we have to always be sure that we're using whatever platform we can to dispel incorrect facts. Whenever I hear people's concerns about not being able to go to the same doctor anymore, that's not true, and I would love to talk with every single person who's afraid of that. There is no in-network and out-of-network with Medicare for All anymore. It's all in-network, and that's an amazing thing, and you don't lose it if you lose your job. And
so let's stick with you for a second, Ms. Ashcraft, and then let the other candidates jump back in on this. You're saying you're not willing to compromise. If you're elected to Congress and you're part of a Democratic majority in the House, let's just toss out other scenarios. Let's just say there's a Republican Senate again. Do you not do anything on healthcare for the next 2 years, hoping or however long it might take to get to a Democratic Senate with a Democratic president with a Democratic House to move something like Medicare for All, not even knowing if you'd have the votes for it then? But are you really not willing to do anything on healthcare in the meantime?
Thank you for asking for clarification. I will vote for every step we take in the right direction. I will vote yes. But I don't think that we should be offering compromises before even being in Congress. And so I am coming into Congress fighting for Medicare for All, not Medicare for kids, which is a compromise. I also wanted to say that I think about people like my father, who does have a disability, and he misplaced his hearing aids, and on his private health insurance, which he pays $2,000 per month per person for him and my mom for right now through Marketplace Insurance, he has to pay $4,000 out of pocket to get new hearing aids. So these are the kinds of things that have to be included, or else we're leaving out entire communities that haven't had a vocal representative fighting on their behalf.
Mr. Patel, go ahead, jump back in, and then we'll go to Mr. Harrison.
Yeah, again, I think that I agree. I guess that's what I mean, that I'll vote for every single step that gets us farther and farther towards the goal, or closer and closer, towards the goal of Medicare for All. It's very simply put, and I think nicely put by Laura, and I agree.
And Mr. Harrison,
So,
compromise, willing to compromise, willing to take incremental steps? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think, Ben, your question is really important. I don't think I didn't hear it quite from either of the challengers. The idea of, we can talk about coalitions, we can talk about campaigns. We don't have the votes yet in the Democratic caucus for this. And I think part of the problem is we, as a party, we've kind of conceded the playing field. We are playing on sort of Republicans' bad faith arguments about the fiscal and monetary policies in this country, what's possible, what's responsible. I always joke about it. Everybody talks about deficits, but Republicans only fake care about deficits, but Democratic leadership actually does care about deficits. And that kind of mentality just plays into the bad faith arguments of Republicans. So I think electing new progressives that kind of reject the rules of the game in DC, you've got to sort of pretend to care about deficits when there's a Democrat in office in the White House or otherwise. Like, that is a broken system. And again, it's, from our perspective, it's a broken system, but it's working as it's supposed to for the corporate interest, the extremist billionaires, the real estate developers that are down there. So talking about it that way and getting better Democrats that are, I think there are a lot of folks that are not quite above water yet that agree that it's kind of a broken system, and it's sort of silly that Republicans can get a $1.7 trillion tax bill. They can throw $30 billion at farmers during Trump's trade war, but they can't pay for NYCHA. Like,
it gets at
a false argument.
A quick follow-up for anybody who wants to jump in, but briefly before we move on to our next topic. If there is a situation, these grand bargains that happen, these relief packages to a crisis where lots of stuff winds up getting thrown in, is there something that you've heard from the other side of the aisle that you're willing to give on? Is there an idea, that's sort of considered a Republican or conservative or even moderate, center-right idea? That's something you think you would be willing to go along with to get one of your goals? Go ahead, Mr. Harrison.
Yeah, Obamacare was the Republican answer. It was this trifecta: public-private subsidy, market rate. That was the idea. And of course, the second it became a possibility under the Obama administration, Republicans ran away from it. So we do have to acknowledge that the Republican Party is not a responsible partner in governance. It's easy for us to say here in deep blue New York City that, but for those Republicans, and honestly, that's the argument that Representative Maloney makes a lot of why we can't do more stuff. But if you accept that premise that Republicans are not a good faith actor, and they're not, they're stacking the bench, the federal benches right now during a pandemic.
Yeah,
we've got to fight that. And that does mean giving up some money in politics. That means not being afraid of the sensibilities of white suburbanites and talking about justice and talking about the larger points of our economic power at the federal level. We're not doing that as a party.
So you went in the opposite direction of my question. Okay, but that's okay. Anybody else want to jump in on this real quick?
Yeah.
Sure. Happy to. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So I did want to say, I don't think that we should be afraid of the fact that not all Democrats are on board with Medicare for All yet. And that is what I was talking about earlier, is because of organizing and educational campaigns and speaking with other representatives like Representative Jeffries. This is how we change votes, and this is how partnering with grassroots organizing in the community really does make a difference. And I wish we saw more of that at the federal level. I also want to say that I've had really fruitful conversations with people across the entire spectrum politically. And the number one thing that I always have to dispel is misinformation about what Medicare for All means. And as soon as we can talk about the fact that, no, it shouldn't be connected to your employment, that means when you lose your job, you lose your health care. No.
Go ahead, Mr. Patel. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Are you the one who's going to give Mitch McConnell something here in our debate or no?
Oh, that's just
Go ahead.
Face there. I will tell you this. There are several bills out there that have nothing to do, unfortunately, with Medicare for All, but that taking the current system we have, like, for example, adding price transparency to healthcare, which is something that a lot of Republicans, some Republicans support, but Democrats should as well, because in the current system, you are tagged with hidden bills and things like that. I mean, if I was given the opportunity right now to save Americans on healthcare in this current system, I would, of course, as a responsible steward for and a representative of my district, I would say yes. Let's get price transparency in healthcare. So there's a few things out there that maybe would be fine to tinker with, but we need systemic change.
Okay. Next topic, we're moving on to climate change and climate justice, and we're going to start this round back with Mr. Patel, then Ms. Ashcraft, and Mr. Harrison. You correct me if I'm wrong. You all support the Green New Deal, but what are some specific actions, again, maybe more along the incremental line? What are some specific actions you support in order to combat climate change, and specific actions you want to push to the forefront in terms of transition in the economy, in terms of green jobs? So go ahead, Mr. Patel.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And yes, exactly. Full stop. I think we all in this race support Green New Deal. So I'm going to leave that on the side and talk about something unique here. Earlier this year, my 12-year-old self would be giddy with myself because I got a byline in Scientific American, which is exciting for me, but personally as a nerd. But we launched a project called the Discovery Project, which is something I've been working on for several months, more than several months now. And it calls for a space race scale investment in federal research and development. So back during the Apollo era, we spent 2% of our GDP on research and development. Today, that number is more like 0.7%. That's a $300 billion gap. in technologies, in NIH funding, in CDC funding, and of course in climate resiliency and carbon capture and things like that. You see, we're not going to be able to do this thing without innovating our way out of this problem, and we need massive new discoveries. I teach at NYU, I'm a business ethics professor. I talk about market failures a lot. There's a failure in our market when we rely only on the private sector to do research and development, because they only research and develop things that are immediately profitable. And some of the most basic science we need is not being tapped into or researched into because there's no one filling the void for long-term risky projects. And I mean things like, how do we deal with climate resilience and pandemics and virology, all those things. So I think we have to make a massive innovation investment with federal dollars that then would reap back rewards directly to every American and taxpayers. So that's my unique add-on to the obviously Green New Deal.
Thank you, Ms. Ashcraft.
Yep, so I just want to talk very briefly about the Green New Deal. One part of it is a jobs guarantee, and it doesn't get talked about enough. So the Green New Deal brings jobs to our local economy, and it's a win-win for every single person. So we absolutely have to keep talking about all of the different pieces of that framework. And on top of that, I am also fighting for public transportation to be free, to be nationalized, because no one, and this is a criminal justice reform issue as well, and you'll see that all of these issues intersect with each other. No one should go to jail for not having $2.75 at the subway turnstile. So we should make it free, but also incentivize the use of the greenest method of transportation possible. We also need to end subsidies to factory farms and ensure that we are incentivizing sustainable farming practices and helping local small family-owned businesses as well. And we absolutely have to keep pushing to have frontline communities at every conversation about how climate change policy affects them personally. Because at the center of all of these decisions, frontline communities are the first and hardest hit to experience any negative downsides to any piece of legislation. And I know just right outside my window, there's a fossil fuel burning plant that's right next to Queensbridge. And I think about how these communities have gone completely neglected and ignored all this time. So we have to make sure to center frontline communities. We have to, in this policy, also include jobs and training to our local economy. And we have to keep pushing to stop throwing money at things that hurt us. But yes, we can and should spend money on policies that are helping to save future generations from our destructive decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Harrison.
Ben, I'm just going to push back before I get my answer here. You're saying like, what are incremental or what are reasonable things to do? And I want to push back a little bit that I think what we're talking about are reasonable things. They're not incremental, but they're reasonable. They're necessary, and I think they're inevitable. So, a little pushback on that. But, I certainly agree with everybody on Green New Deal. The homes guarantee, we talk a lot about decarbonizing the housing stock and retrofitting in terms of the Green New Deal for public housing, which I got to work on before running with Data for Progress. What I think has been my unique add to this, and I appreciate Lauren supporting free public transportation. I disagree about nationalizing it. I'm very proud to be the first federal candidate to introduce a plan to make all public transportation in this country 100% free, accessible, and green. It's called the Freedom of Movement in America Plan. We released it back in February. Made a lot of Republicans mad and got a lot of bike people excited. But again, that's a big idea, but it's reasonable to do it on the ground. And it's a long plan. I won't get into the specific details of it, but the bottom line is 29% of carbon emissions in this country come from the transportation system. It comes from the fact that we built an entire infrastructure of highways out to the suburbs, again, subsidizing white home ownership. I am an avowed urbanist. I am fighting in one of the most urban districts in the country. We need urbanists that are fighting for public transportation. It should be free. You're not free if you can't afford $2 to go to the school. You're not free if you can't walk down the stairs to get on the train. You're not free if you're like one flat tire away from losing your job and the cycle of poverty continuing. So freedom has to be retaken by the Democratic Party. The idea of what freedom means. It's not the freedom to go and like reopen the economy and whatever you want during a pandemic. It's the freedom from struggling to just get around in your own city. And I think those are entirely reasonable things that I'm deeply proud to be a part of. And I'm excited by other candidates and some other races that have been kind of embracing this idea as well.
Before we get we're going to move on. Before we get into our next topic, kind of an interlude question. If you're elected to Congress, would you support Speaker Pelosi for Speaker again? And if not, do you have someone in mind who should be the next Speaker of the House? Let's go ahead with Mr. Patel.
Yeah, I got to say just off the bat, I remember being working for the Obama campaign in 2008 and being involved in the administration in those early years when I was still in law school. And then after that, I worked in it. And I remember Speaker Pelosi was incredible at delivering bills that died at the Senate, including on climate change and others. So I think Speaker Pelosi's had an amazing tenure as a masterful tactician throughout her career, and I have the utmost respect for her. But look, I'm in a race challenging a Democrat because I know Democrats can do better. I know that the problems that the Trump administration is exacerbating predated him. He's a symptom. And so I think everyone should be under review. I would happily consider any candidate running against Speaker Pelosi, and depending on if they're more progressive, if they're more effective, I would consider them. Of course, I believe in competition in politics, bar none.
Ms. Ashcraft?
To be completely transparent, I would not. I'm actually endorsed by her challenger and co-endorsed him back, Shahid Buttar, and very, very proud to support other grassroots challengers across the entire country. So people that I would support for Speaker of the House are people that don't show the amount of disconnectedness that Representative Pelosi has shown in a crisis. Just as an example, showing how much gourmet ice cream she has in her freezer, but also taking corporate PAC money, voting for war. We need to move past, thinking that just because someone's been in Congress for a very long time, it doesn't mean that they have the experience and empathy that it takes to lead anymore. So I support grassroots candidates, people who have gotten into their position, not through corporate PAC money, but through hard work and small dollar donations like our campaign.
Mr. Harrison.
Look, I have an immense amount of respect for Speaker Pelosi. Being the first woman Speaker of the House is not an easy task. Managing the Democratic caucus is not an easy task. And I think it's fair to acknowledge that. But I do not see myself supporting Speaker Pelosi for some of the reasons I think both Roran and Suraj brought up. And I think one specific example of this is going back to what I was saying earlier, pushing back on you, like we do need to think big. Politics are not about technocratic solutions. And trust me, I'm a policy nerd that's written stuff. That's really important. But politics are about values. And the Democratic Party has abandoned the working class for decades. And unfortunately, Speaker Pelosi has been very much a part of that. So if we want to get back to the roots of being a working class driven party, and just to clarify what I mean by that is if you only make money when you're awake, you are working class. I don't care what your job title is. I don't care how much money you have. That's the reality. More people are working class than I think even are told by Democrats. So we've got to have a bigger coalition of folks saying we want working class representatives, we want working class leaders, we want working class laws passed. And I do not think Speaker Pelosi can do that. In terms of replacements,
quickly, please.
Sorry?
Quickly, please. Go ahead.
Barbara Lee's awesome. Maxine Waters is awesome.
Very good.
I bet you didn't think you were going to be part of the debate. And when you agreed to do
I'm used to it. Couple quick questions before we go on to a more full round. Do any of you oppose the legalization of adult use marijuana?
No.
Anybody oppose that? Okay. Does anybody, any of the candidates here, not plan to vote for Joe Biden in the fall election? Everybody's definitely committed to vote for Joe Biden. Okay. So just a couple quick things there that have been thrown my way from some interested parties for you candidates. All right, let's move on to our next topic, which is protecting democracy. We're going to start with Ms. Ashcraft, then go to Mr. Harrison and Mr. Patel. what should be done at the federal level to improve access to the ballot, to improve voting rights? And if you want to segue partway through your answer, what do you believe in terms of campaign finance reform? What's the right path there? So protecting the right to vote and campaign finance reform. Go ahead, Ms. Ashcraft.
Absolutely. Campaign finance reform is my number one issue, because the lack of reform on this issue is why we have such slow progress and incremental steps to fixing the most urgent issues that we're facing. We rely on the fossil fuel industry because they throw money at our politicians. We have mass incarceration in part because for-profit prisons and these lobbies are throwing money at our politicians. I fight for public financing of federal elections, and also an idea around vouchers that people can use to donate to campaigns that reject corporate and super PAC money. And other things that we can do at the federal level to make sure that every single person can vote is automatic voter registration, ranked choice voting, which expands somebody's voice and vote. And I wish we had it, frankly, in this election, because it is a crowded primary, and it would allow people to rank us and vote for all of us in the order they see fit. I also am for mail-in ballots for every single election going forward with prepaid postage. And talk about wasted money. I know all three of us on this stage, fundraising is a huge concern for people running for office not taking corporate PAC money. And I love the idea of having information about each campaign that's on the ballot in a packet sent along with mail-in ballots, so that people can educate themselves without having to use the internet or without having to go way out of their way about what they're voting for and why it matters.
Thank you. Mr. Harrison.
It's not a secret that the Republicans cannot win national elections if more people come out and vote. That has been the political project of the right for years. We're seeing that come to fruition, and it's really scary. And we were in trouble before COVID-19 in terms of our election integrity. President Trump has talked about how easy it is to have fraudulence and mail-in voters. I think 14 states already do this as a law for everybody. So there's an immense amount of bad faith and misinformation happening here. And I think you talked about this, and coming back to how do we get incremental change and how we get some structural change, it's stacked against us because of demographics. Democrats are shifting towards urban centers. The sort of rural, more suburban exurb areas are overrepresented in the Electoral College. I think all of us in this race want to get rid of the Electoral College, want to have automatic voting registration, want to reverse some of the Roberts Court decisions about voter rights. We're all in agreement about that, but how do we actually get there? And obviously I think we're also in agreement on getting corporate money out of it. One of the major things that I think we need to talk about as well is the fact that New York State is going to lose one, possibly even two congressional districts in the next census. So as very much I want everyone to come out and vote on June 23rd or by June 23rd, almost more importantly, I want everyone to fill out the census. But that's still not enough. We're still, again, Democrats accepting this premise that no matter what we do in New York, even though the population is growing, we're going to lose representation here. I think that's completely crazy. And naturally, everything in American politics goes back to racism and sexism and xenophobia. That's that 435 cap that we have in Congress was demonstrably put in to stop folks in the North and stop folks in the cities from voting. So that's got to be an issue that we overcome and expand the size of Congress.
Thank you. Mr. Patel.
Yeah, thanks, guys. And Lauren, great idea. I'd never thought of the information in ballots, but that's great. Guys, I'm an attorney. I'm the only one in this race that is. I graduated from law school in 2010, and if you want to look back at 2011 and 12, I taught continuing legal education around gerrymandering, money in politics, and voting rights, available in 1 hour long, very detailed and boring conversations that I have with legal experts on this issue. It is one of the reasons that I was running from day one 3 years ago, which is that money in politics has eroded our democracy, and corporate money, especially after Buckley v. Valet was decided, has flooded our system with money and perverted our democracy. So when large majorities of Americans want action on gun control, on reproductive rights, on climate change, and yet Congress and Washington's not reflective of it, it's because we have a democracy that's not representative of the will of the people. So we need to root out gerrymandering. We need to ban corporate money in politics. We need to publicly finance elections. Absolutely. Every one of those things is on the table. Many of them would require constitutional amendment because the Supreme Court has wrongly decided that money equals speech. When I go buy Coca-Cola, I go buy Coca-Cola because I want to drink a Coca-Cola. I am not speaking about my expression of how I support Coca-Cola. And so I think this whole idea, this premise that money is speech in politics and the ability to unlimitedly spend it is poorly decided.
Let me follow this up with a chance for everybody to jump in on this. Talk about your campaign financing of your campaign. Have you taken any campaign finance pledges? If so, what are they? If not, why not? Discuss a little bit about your approach to that as you're trying to get elected and modeling perhaps what you believe should be the right equation at the federal level. Why don't we come back to Mr. Harrison to start?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I took a pledge pretty early to not take any corporate money, fossil fuel money, real estate money, not that they'd give it to me. Very proud to continue that. If you've ever seen my FEC, I haven't taken money from a lot of people. To be honest, I had felt pretty bad asking for money during pandemic when a lot of people have lost jobs. But we are proud that of the money we've raised, the majority of it has been in the city, in the district. That's not necessarily true for some of the other folks in the race. So we have, I think, started out talking about trying to change the conversation and about money in politics. I think we've run a hell of a campaign with very limited resources, but I will say that it is still almost impossible for grassroots working class candidates. I teach at Baruch. I had to work up until 2 weeks ago and the semester was done. I can't afford to run without that. The media, and Ben, you're great. I'll come to your defense here, but a lot of the mainstream media plays the money games. To some degree, they play the social media game. They say who's the real challengers here. So the fact is, money talks both directly by who gets in the room for elections, who gets in the room for lobbying bills, but the media is not doing a good job of expanding the conversation, what our focus in. And that's certainly a lesson that I think some of us have learned the hard way during this cycle. So we've got a long way to go. I think there are alternative structures that the left and the grassroots are putting in place. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting there. But we are still at a massive disadvantage, not just against Republicans, but certainly against the corporate Democrats. And
it's Ashcraft,
we're doing what we can.
Yeah, so while I agree, I wish media would highlight grassroots campaigns much more. I think the conversation around fundraising is a real thing, because in order to win, you need to be able to afford to send out mailers until we incorporate my idea of including information about each candidate in the ballot with mail-in ballots. We need to be able to pay for digital ads. We need to be able to reach every single voter that we can, and that costs money. That's why money matters, and we're very proud to have the most small dollars raised in the entire race. We have 6 figures of fundraising, and most of that comes from small dollars. Our average donation is $16, which shows that we have thousands of individuals supporting our campaign and for the movement that it is. And it also does speak to why we have a very large volunteer base and why we've been able to secure so much momentum in these final weeks. So
thank you. Mr. Patel?
Yeah, I also take no corporate PAC money. I think everyone in this race, other than the representative who sits in Washington, doesn't take corporate PAC money. And I think that's a huge difference. Obviously, the biggest difference between us three and the current representative. If you believe that Citizens United was wrongly decided, then I don't understand how you would not walk the walk and actually not take corporate money as well. So I agree with everyone. It's awful to have to raise money in campaigns. I do, I make phone calls to raise money from people in 3 languages. And when people give to a campaign, it's because they have many reasons: hope, representation, the idea of seeing someone that looks like them in office. All those things are valid reasons and have been valid reasons for people to contribute in campaigns in the past. But when a corporation gives money to a campaign, it only has one objective: return on investment. And that's why it needs to be stopped.
Thank you. Just real quick follow-up. some mentions of small donations, donations in district, out of district. Does anybody want to clarify further, where the money you have raised is coming from? Any of those thoughts in terms of clarifying further? And if you think there should be any type of limits on, out of district, out of city, out of state fundraising. Just a quick thought each.
I will add one more thing. Look, last time I checked, Wall Street was not in our district. The fact that the bulk of Representative Maloney's contributions come from the financial services industries, PACs, life insurance companies, and others, and then she turns around and deregulates them, that's the problem. And frankly, most of these corporations are not domiciled here, and they're not people. So I think there's a big distinction there.
Do you know, Mr. Patel, in terms of your fundraising, what's in district versus out of district?
Yeah, I gotta say that we have received contributions from people from, frankly, all across the country. My two main fundraising bases include progressive Democrats, people I worked with in the Obama administration, and people who contributed to that administration are massive contributors to our campaign. The other piece is this, Ben. There's not a single South Asian person in office in New York City. In the state of New York, there's one state senator. That means out of Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Indian American, Nepali American, and Sri Lankan Americans, not a single person in one of the most diverse city in the world is in office. So we have a wellspring of support from people of the Indian American and South Asian community who want to see a representative in the tri-state area between New Jersey and Long Island and everywhere. And I think it's completely valid to raise money from them, and that's frankly a big chunk of my support.
Thank you. Ms. Ashcraft?
Yeah, so the small dollars that I'm referencing is under $200. So 60% of what we fundraise is unitemized and under $200, and the majority of that does come from in district and working class people who are excited about seeing me fight for them, and I would be honored to represent them.
Mr. Harris?
I just
go
wanted
ahead.
to very quickly say one thing that I do want to point out as a difference between Mr. Patel's campaign and mine is we are majority small dollar, while I believe 97% of Suraj Patel's fundraising is large dollar and itemized. So his average donation is $1,700, and he has many fewer donors than I do. Our average donation is small dollar, and we have thousands of people supporting our campaign, showing the movement behind us.
We're going to go to Mr. Harrison, but quick response, Mr. Patel. Yep.
My average donation is not $1,700.
Okay, we'll have to look at that after. Okay, Mr. Harrison, any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think I am certainly not equating corporate money with the type of money that Lauren or Suraj has raised. Absolutely not equating it. But I think the model for city races of rewarding in-district donations is the model that we need at the federal district, because there is a question of saying if you get more of your money outside of the district, and some degree challengers kind of have to do that, it's sort of fair. But what representation is that? Again, I do not have the most money in the race. That's not a mystery. But I am proud that the majority of my money does come from the district. And we can spin, we can come back and forth on all this stuff. But I think we probably all do agree that we should incentivize a system where that is matched, like the city level, where somebody that can vote for us giving us $5 means a lot more than somebody giving $5 from any other type of community outside of the district.
So,
I think that Warren is not the same thing as corporate money, but I do think we should get to that system.
We're going to try to get to a couple other quick things here before we go to closing statements in just a few minutes. It occurs to me as we're having this conversation about fundraising and a little bit of comparison, small dollar, bigger dollar, in district, out of district. You've all, of course, been attacking the incumbent tonight and through the campaign. You want to unseat her. That's no surprise. Maybe each take, a minute on sort of the state of the race. Last time, this was a one-on-one contest with Mr. Patel, who, I think surprised people with his performance, but did not win, obviously. You all want to see someone more progressive, as you said, a younger generation take office here. With all three of you in the race, is that possible?
Yeah, 100% it's possible. A political election that requires 30,000 votes out of 720,000 people can be won with any number of candidates in the race. Absolutely. you're not running against each other. It's like golf. You're playing the course, and we feel like we're in the strong position right now to win this race. We really do, sincerely, because we've made hundreds of thousands of phone calls into the district.
Who do you need to reach that you didn't reach last time, 2 years ago?
I'll admittedly, to broaden the electorate, which vote by mail is assisting us in doing by making the electorate significantly more representative of the population as a whole. That already gives us a significant advantage over the representative, who has cultivated a small number of people who vote in these low turnout elections in a typical manner. The next thing I will say is that I will admittedly say I learned, you don't run for office to make a statement. You run to win so that you can make a difference, make an impact. That's why I'm in this race. Of course, I've raised a significant amount of money because it puts me in position to defeat the incumbent. And between the hundreds of thousands of phone calls we've made in the district, the hundreds of active volunteers we have, and everything else, and the name recognition we started with, we feel like we're in the strongest position to pull this thing off. We need to reach more of the Upper East Side and voters that, frankly, didn't just know about us 2 years ago, because it's hard to penetrate that part of the district since you can't knock on doors.
Ms. Ashcraft, your thoughts on sort of the state of the race?
Yeah,
part of the reason I ask is we saw a little bit of a consolidation in another congressional race recently, and I think it's been on people's minds in various races where there's a crowded field. So go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all have the goal of unseating Representative Maloney, who has voted against our best interest for many years. And I am proud to say I'm the first challenger in the race, and also have secured the most endorsements. We also do have hundreds of volunteers, about 600 at this point, and we make thousands of phone calls per day. And voters have expressed to us they're looking for an alternative to Representative Maloney, and find hope and find a vision in our campaign and what I'm fighting for, which is the working class people who've gone ignored all this time.
Thank you.
Yep. And I just quickly want to say, last cycle, in the debate, Representative Maloney commented on how she would rarely reject any kind of corporate PAC money or any kind of this money that we're all rejecting. And I actually just wanted to pose the question to her, what would happen if you did? That would level the playing field, and I believe it means that she does not feel secure enough to be able to win her district without being propped up by corporations.
Well, that's 100% true, because over 51% of her money comes from the corporations, so she would be one of the lowest raisers in this race.
Let's go to Mr. Harrison for a thought on the race and the challengers, and then we're going to go to closing statements.
Yeah, I think I have been living in this district for 14 years. I have been organizing on the ground in a number of different communities, a number of different, sorry, I thought I froze for a second. A number of different parts of this district. And at the end of the day, I trust voters in New York 12. I trust Democrat voters to make the best decision for who represents us. There are so many variables in elections that I don't think strike the average person as fair or maybe as efficient. And that's, again, playing the course, as Suraj said. But I think the wild card of all of this is, of course, the pandemic, is the vote by mail. And I do think all of us, having plenty of volunteers, are making plenty of calls. And there's an opportunity to expand the electorate that didn't exist, which I think is a great argument for making it easier to vote. So I'm very optimistic that there are, frankly, paths for a number of different scenarios where challengers can win. And that, I think, is a very good thing for the Democratic Party and good thing for you as well. I am worried about the Board of Elections mucking this up. We're certainly getting calls of people getting the wrong ballots. Things are not going out correctly. They don't do the right thing under the best of circumstances. So I think certainly all of us are doing our best to monitor that and make sure voters are heard.
Certainly.
Quick plug there. Sure. A quick plug. We are also very concerned for any one of you watching out there. When you receive your ballot in the mail, you have to vote and put no extra marks anywhere on it because it'll get rejected. And then when you put it in the envelope to mail back to the board, you must sign that envelope because they will not accept it if it isn't signed. And we know a lot of people, you wouldn't think you'd have to sign an envelope.
We have a whole explainer article at Gotham Gazette for how to vote absentee properly. So everybody should go check that out. All right, let's go to closing statements here. We're going to go to Ms. Ashcraft first, then Mr. Harrison, then Mr. Patel to close us out. Before we start opening statements, I'll say a quick goodbye at the end, but before closing statements, while people are still listening, I just want to thank very much Empire State Indivisible for pulling this together. It's always important to bring candidates together so voters can hear from them. And of course, the video of this debate will be available either later tonight or early tomorrow at Gotham Gazette and at other places through Empire State Indivisible and other partners. So thank you, and let's move into closing statements. Ms. Ashcraft, you're up.
Yeah, so thank you again for having this debate tonight. Empire State Indivisible, thank you, Ben, for moderating. Thank you to everyone who took the time to tune in and be part of this very important conversation. Again, my name is Lauren Ashcraft. I'm running to represent the 12th Congressional District, because in a democracy, every single person deserves to have an equal voice. And we sure are not seeing that as the case. My family, as well as so many New Yorkers, know that that is not the case. That's why I've been angry. That's why I have been fighting for gender justice and social equality through helping to plan the Women's March on New York, and also helping to raise awareness around some of the most urgent issues our society faces. Issues like the fact that New York's 12th Congressional District is the third most unequal district in the entire country. That means in this district, people are having to choose between having food on their table and having health insurance. People are having to choose between having a home and paying off their student debt. And I myself have struggled with those issues. I've been pushed out of homes because of rising rent. I also recognize that I am privileged to have health insurance through my domestic partner right now, but these are not decisions we should have to make anymore, now or ever. That's why I'm running for single-payer Medicare for all, for a Green New Deal, to cancel student debt, for true criminal justice reform, and also to make sure that our federal government fights for people over profit, which we absolutely will not get if we keep electing somebody who takes so much corporate PAC money. I bring with me the struggles of my family. My grandmother, who was an immigrant from Japan, who faced an immense amount of xenophobia and racism throughout her life. My grandfather, who was a coal miner, literally killed by corporate greed, and his family was left to pay their bills and put food on the table with a really small Social Security check. My other grandfather fell while he was working and became a quadriplegic. He didn't have the money to hire a caretaker. That was us. So whenever I'm fighting for people like my family that have gone ignored all this time. I'm fighting for people like you. I'm fighting for us. And I really appreciate that we got to discuss my platform tonight. I appreciate your consideration for true representation in New York's 12th Congressional District. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Harrison, over to you for a closing statement.
Well, I want to start by thanking everybody at Empire State Indivisible for hosting this debate. Ben, thank you so much for moderating and participating in it, I guess, in some cases. I certainly want to wish Representative Maloney well. I hope she gets better. Hope to see her on the New York 1 debate coming up. And I want to thank Suraj and Lauren for being here as well. But most of all, I want to thank you out there in New York 12 for watching. At the end of the day, this is your race. It's not ours. And we have all been through an immense amount over these last few months and these last few weeks. And I'm, afraid that we're not through it yet. But right now, you have the opportunity to do something about where we're going. This election is an honest to God choice. You can choose a candidate who has taken Donald Trump's real estate money, or you can choose a candidate who has a plan to take away Donald Trump's real estate money. You can choose a candidate who has made money during the housing crisis, or you can choose somebody who spent years fighting to keep people in their homes. You can choose the status quo and the same old political platitudes, or you can choose somebody who's been doing the work, writing the policies, and fighting for the values that we need in New York 12 right now. That's what I have been doing in this community on the ground for over 10 years. And it's what I'm ready to do day one in Congress for all of you. So I want to say thank you, be safe. I hope to have your support, and good night and God bless.
Thank you. Mr. Patel.
Thank you all for being here today, for tuning in, for the other candidates for being here, and such a substantive and cordial debate. I thank you for that. That's what politics should be like. My name is Suraj Patel. I'm an attorney, a professor of business ethics, and I worked for the greatest president of our lifetimes, Barack Obama. I am also the son of Naina and Champak Patel, two immigrants who left India with their whole family to move to the United States with almost nothing. And one of my first memories are of waking up in a one-bedroom apartment with 11 other people sleeping on the floor in a line above the bodega that we were running. You see, my parents would wake up at 4:30 in the morning on Sunday mornings to put the newspaper together one piece at a time in order to sell it in their bodega and make an extra nickel or a dime. It is a testament to the power of opportunity, education, and mobility, the American dream, that they get to see their son in print in that newspaper as a candidate for US Congress, that they got to see their son work for the most powerful man in the world. Now, far too many people on both sides of the East River are shut out of education and opportunity. My story is way too infrequent and way too much the exception rather than the rule, and that is because of a decades-old status quo politics that just won't do. And you don't have to look any further than the fact that we have strong, diverse challengers in this race, because it's not just me. Everyone and a lot of people in this district now believe that this district needs change, just like America needs change. And our representative embodies some of the worst parts of the status quo and the system that we've all come to detest. So I'm asking you to vote for change this June 23rd. This is a season for change. If you want change in November, then you have to lead right here in New York with it as well. And so I'm asking for your support. I ask humbly for your vote. The next 10 years is going to require somebody in this seat who is going to work to heal and bind up these communities and this city and our small businesses. And frankly, somebody who will not tolerate anymore a single black man or boy or woman or girl in our country being murdered by the police.
Thank you. Thank you to the candidates. Thank you to Empire State Indivisible. Thank you to all who are watching or have watched tonight, and everybody who's going to vote in New York 12 or across the city, state, country. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.